When most people think of slavery, they imagine chains clanking under the sun, the cracking of a whip, and the anguished cries that rose from the fields. The story is usually told through the image of the black woman violated by the white master, her pain visible and undeniable. But history hides other rooms, quiet ones where power wore a softer face. Behind lace curtains and candlelight, there existed another kind of violence, one that left no bruises to show and no language strong enough to name it. It was the abuse of black men by white women, acts erased from public memory because they violated the myths on which an entire society rested. The South liked to see its white women as angels, pure, delicate, incapable of cruelty. They were placed on pedestals sheltered from labour and sin. Yet those pedestals were built on the backs of enslaved men and women they owned. Within their households, these women commanded cooks, drivers, gardeners, and stable boys. Every order they gave was backed by law and enforced by the threat of the auction block. That power, absolute and unquestioned, sometimes stretched far beyond the kitchen or the fields. It reached into the most private corners of human life. An enslaved man might be summoned late at night, not to fetch water or mend a garment, but to enter a room lit only by a single lamp, where his mistress waited in silence. To refuse meant punishment or death. To obey meant surrendering the last thing slavery had not yet stolen, his body's own will. There was no choice, only survival, and in the morning nothing would be spoken. The woman would return to her parlour, the man to his work, both bound by silence for different reasons, she by shame or fear of scandal, he by terror of the noose. Such stories were rarely written down, but traces of them remain. Court records whisper of improper intimacy, estate papers note sudden punishments, and later testimonies gathered from the aged voices of the formerly enslaved describe moments when obedience turned into violation. One man told interviewers in the 1930s that the lady of his plantation would call him up to the big house, and that afterward he would be different for days. He never used the word rape. Few men of that generation could, but the weight behind his pauses said everything. In a world where a black man could be lynched for looking at a white woman, how could he accuse one of assault? The danger was constant. White women, though denied political rights, could still destroy a man's life with a single word. They understood the rules of their world and how to bend them. A whisper of improper behaviour, a faint suggestion that a man had overstepped, was enough to summon the sheriff. And once the accusation was made, the outcome was almost certain. No testimony, no evidence, only her word against his, and in the eyes of the law his word meant nothing at all. The bodies of black men became the battlefield on which the purity of white womanhood was defended, even when that purity was an illusion crafted to hide cruelty. Take the case of a man we know only as David, living in early 19th century Virginia. He served in a household run by an unmarried daughter of the owner. According to petitions that later surfaced, she pursued him relentlessly. For years she used the protection of her family's name to conceal the relationship. When David tried to pull away, she turned on him. The story that followed was predictable and devastating. She accused him of rape, he was arrested, condemned, and executed. She received a public whipping and returned to her life. The system had confirmed what everyone already understood, that a white woman's word outweighed a black man's existence. For historians, David's story is not unique but representative. It reveals how gender and race collided in the most perverse ways. White women, oppressed in some aspects by patriarchy, found in slavery a domain where they could be powerful. They could order, punish, and control without question. And some used that authority to claim the bodies of the men they owned. To them it may have felt like agency, a rebellion against male dominance. To the men trapped beneath them, it was yet another form of bondage. In the plantations of Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia, records show how these relationships blurred the line between affection and coercion. A mistress might present herself as kind, protecting a favoured slave from the overseer's whip. She might give him better food or lighter tasks. Then in private, she would demand gratitude in the form of obedience to her every desire. When the man hesitated, the kindness vanished. Threats replaced tenderness. "Do as I say, or I'll sell you down the river." That phrase, "sell you down the river," was the most feared in the vocabulary of slavery. It meant exile to the deep south, to the cotton swamps where survival itself was uncertain. It meant being ripped from family, community, and every shred of self that had managed to survive. For enslaved men, this weaponized intimacy created a prison inside a prison. They were trapped not just by chains, but by the expectations of their oppressors. Even gestures of civility could hide commands. A smile might mean safety, or a summons. A compliment could be the prelude to humiliation. The mental toll was immense. To live every day decoding the whims of a mistress who owned your body required a constant vigilance that exhausted the soul. The cruelty was not always born of desire. Sometimes it was about control, a twisted assertion of dominance in a society that told white women they were powerless. Within their households, they could finally wield absolute authority, and the easiest target for that power was the enslaved man who could never refuse them. When they ordered him to their side, they reversed the hierarchy that limited them in public life. The irony is brutal. Women denied freedom by patriarchy reclaimed it through the enslavement of others. Some mistresses turned this control into policy. After the importation of Africans was outlawed in 1808, the enslaved population had to grow from within. Every birth meant profit. Plantation records kept by women show cold calculations of fertility, notes of pairings, and counts of children born each season. The language used was the language of breeding, terms fit for livestock applied to human beings. A strong man was not just a worker, but a stud. His value was measured in offspring. In some households, white women oversaw this reproductive economy personally, deciding which men would lie with which women, when, and how often. Refusal brought punishment for both. The result was a machinery of coerced intimacy, run behind the genteel facade of domestic order. Imagine Luke, a tall, powerful man enslaved on an Alabama plantation in the 1850s. His size made him valuable, his strength made him profitable, and for that he was denied even the dignity of choice. He was ordered to father children with women he barely knew, each encounter supervised, recorded, and counted. The woman who managed the estate, his mistress, saw him not as a man but as a resource to be managed. Over the years he was said to have fathered dozens of children, none of whom he could raise or protect. Each new child meant more wealth for his owners, more grief for him. When he grew old, the record simply notes that he was retired from field duty. The ledger closed. His life, full of untold anguish, was reduced to a line of ink. To call such acts breeding is to speak the language of the oppressors, but it captures the horror precisely. Slavery was not only about labour, it was about reproduction, about turning flesh into capital generation after generation. And white women, far from being passive observers, often directed the process. Their diaries speak casually of pregnancies and births among the people, as if discussing livestock. They recorded which pairings were productive and which were disappointing. The clinical tone hides the moral catastrophe beneath it, the systematic theft of human intimacy, transformed into economic strategy. For the men forced into these roles, the damage was spiritual as well as physical. They were denied the right to love, to choose, to protect their families. Their children were sold, their partners assigned to others, their identities dissolved into profit margins. The trauma did not end with them. It passed silently to generations who never knew why their fathers carried such sadness in their eyes. Oral histories collected a century later speak of grandfathers who rarely spoke, men who stared into the distance as if seeing ghosts. Perhaps they were remembering nights when survival required silence, when saying no was a death sentence. Even after emancipation, the scars of these hidden crimes lingered. The narrative of white innocence remained intact, reinforced by literature, by churches, by the new mythology of the Southern lady. Meanwhile, any black man accused of desiring a white woman faced immediate danger. The irony is unbearable. Those who had been coerced and exploited were now portrayed as predators. Lynch mobs avenged imaginary assaults, while the real ones, those committed by women of privilege, vanished from history books. Silence protected the guilty and imprisoned the survivors. To speak of what had happened was to risk everything. So men kept their stories locked inside, turning their pain into endurance, their shame into resilience. Generations later, historians began to piece together fragments, the lawsuits, the diaries, the coded phrases in old letters, and what emerged was a portrait of a hidden world of domination and fear. It forces us to rethink what power looked like under slavery, to see that oppression wore many faces, including the one society once called innocent. That is the story we begin to tell now, not to shock, but to reveal. to say that freedom was stolen not only through chains and whips, but through whispers in candlelit rooms, through the abuse of power wrapped in silk and perfume. It is a story about men who could not say no, women who could not bear accountability, and a world built on lies so deep that it silenced truth for a century. Yet truth survives, in the margins of documents, in the cautious words of the aged, in the bloodlines that remain. And when we listen closely, we can still hear them, those men whose pain was never written, but whose endurance shaped the generations that followed. Freedom came to the South in 1865, but for many of the men who had lived through slavery's hidden abuses, liberty did not erase the fear that had ruled their lives. The chains had fallen, yet silence still held them. The women who had once owned them now walked past in black mourning gowns, lamenting a lost world built on other people's suffering. They were praised as symbols of grace and endurance, the ladies of the Old South. No one mentioned what some of them had done behind closed doors. The past was being rewritten in real time, and truth was the first casualty. In the new mythology, the Southern woman was spotless. Her image, wrapped in lace and sorrow, became the proof that the Confederate cause had been noble. Newspapers called her the guardian of virtue. Sermons compared her to saints. The idea that such women could have dominated or violated the men they enslaved was unthinkable. Society needed her to be innocent, because that innocence justified everything else. The consequences of that lie were deadly. In the decades after the war, white politicians and journalists built an entire system of racial terror on the claim that black men were a danger to white women. It was the perfect inversion. The real victims recast as predators. Lynch mobs gathered under that banner, stringing up men for imagined glances and fabricated crimes. The same mythology that once protected mistresses from accountability now demanded black blood to preserve their honor. The pattern of control had merely changed its costume. Those who had lived through slavery carried memories they could never safely share. In freedom, they had no protection from disbelief or revenge. To speak aloud that a white woman had once coerced or violated them would invite ruin or death. So the men kept their silence, teaching their sons caution instead of confession. The pain seeped into family stories in fragments, half-spoken references to cruelty, to humiliation, to nights that should have been forgotten but could not be. By the early 20th century, a few hints began to surface. The Federal Writers Project sent interviewers through the South to record the recollections of the formerly enslaved. Most of those accounts were taken by white writers, and their subjects knew the limits of what they could safely say. Yet every so often a sentence slipped through the net. "Mrs. used to call me in late," one man told his interviewer, then stopped. Another said, "She favoured me too much." The recorder changed the subject, but the silence after those words is louder than anything written on the page. It is the sound of generations living with a truth that no one wanted to hear. Modern historians have learned to read those silences. Scholars such as Martha Hodes, Brenda Stevenson, and Thomas A. Foster have traced the fragments scattered across court records, estate ledgers, and family letters. In dusty archives they found phrases like "private service" or "my boy attends me at night." They discovered petitions filed by husbands who suspected their wives of improper familiarity with male servants. They found diaries in which births of light-skinned children were entered in the same column as calves and foals. None of these lines speaks openly, but together they tell a story that can no longer be denied. The Kentucky case of James and his mistress reveals how affection and authority intertwined. To neighbours they appeared inseparable. Within their house she held every thread of control. When angered, she warned him that she could sell him south, a threat that meant separation, harsher labour, and near-certain death. Her affection was a leash. For James, every smile carried the weight of that warning. His survival depended on reading her moods, on performing gratitude he did not feel. Even in apparent intimacy, he remained property. Across the ocean in Brazil, the story of Roque José Florencio, known as Pata Seca, shows how the system could turn a man's body into an instrument of profit. He was chosen not for his mind or skill, but for his physique, forced into repeated pairings, dictated by the women who managed the estate. Local records speak of him fathering hundreds of children, none of whom he was allowed to raise. To the plantation owners he was a producer, not a parent. The women who supervised him recorded each birth as if it were another harvest. Their control was absolute and impersonal, the kind that erases a person's soul while keeping him alive. In Alabama, a man named Luke endured a similar fate. Tall and strong, he was spared the whip but condemned to another kind of servitude, ordered to father children for the profit of his enslavers. The woman who ran the household kept careful notes, ensuring that each union produced results. Luke obeyed because refusal meant punishment for him and for the women forced into those same arrangements. Over the years, the number of his children grew into the tens. When his body aged and his usefulness waned, the records mention only that he was retired. No one wrote of the grief that must have filled his remaining days. Each of these stories reveals how slavery weaponized intimacy itself. It turned the most private act into a transaction of power. The victims were trapped in contradictions, ordered to obey yet blamed for any appearance of desire, commanded to serve yet punished for existing. White women exploited the small arena of authority allowed to them by patriarchy, exercising dominion over those whom society deemed even lower. Their cruelty was not a rumor or an exception. It was a structural part of a world that measured worth in ownership. When emancipation came, that structure did not vanish. It shifted. The myths that had protected white women during slavery now demanded vengeance for imagined threats. Every rumor of impropriety between a black man and a white woman became a spark for mob violence. What had once been private coercion turned into public terror. The same lie, that whiteness made women pure and blackness made men dangerous, survived into the 20th century, fueling thousands of lynchings and legal injustices. It was only in the late 20th century that historians began to speak of enslaved men as victims of sexual violence. Until then, the very idea challenged assumptions about gender and power. People asked, how could a woman violate a man? The answer lay in the structures of domination, in the ownership of the body, in the threats that made refusal impossible, in the laws that denied black men humanity. Scholars like Foster and Hodes reframed the conversation, showing that consent cannot exist under coercion, that silence is not agreement, and that masculinity does not protect against violation. Understanding this history demands empathy, not defensiveness. It does not erase the suffering of enslaved women, it completes the picture. It shows that slavery was a total system of control that consumed everyone it touched. The same society that exploited women's labor in the home allowed them in turn to exploit the men they enslaved. Power flowed downward in every direction. Today, reading their stories is like standing in a room where the air still remembers screams. The furniture gleams, the portraits smile from the walls, and beneath that surface lingers the memory of commands whispered in the night. The violence was polite, hidden under civility, but no less real. It lived in the tremor of a man's hands as he poured a cup of tea, in the quick glance that measured whether kindness was safe to accept. When we tell these stories now, we do so to reclaim humanity from silence. We speak the names of David, James, Luke, and Pataseka, not as footnotes but as witnesses. Their lives expose the hypocrisy of a culture that preached virtue while practicing domination. They remind us that oppression can wear a gentle smile, that cruelty can sound like affection, and that history's deepest wounds are often the ones hidden behind locked doors. The truth does not require graphic words to be unbearable. It lives in the imbalance of power, in the terror of obedience, in the generations who inherited pain they could not explain. To recognize that is to honor those who endured it. Their silence was not consent, it was survival. And now, at last, survival gives way to remembrance.